Hey all, and welcome back to Phrecia Gaming and a new video on the channel. A lot of people have been asking me if I'm playing the new event and what my plans are, so we'll just jump right into it. I'm definitely playing the new event. I've actually been back on POE 1 doing a few SSF runs just for fun, and I'm really enjoying the game. Now there's a lot of builds I want to try in this event, but I think some items that are going to make popular builds tick might be crazy expensive. So I'm going to go with my own build because I'm going to play this event fairly casually for fun. I don't want to get stuck into a build that needs a 20 divine item for it to work. So as I said, the build I'm looking to do is for fun, but with investment, it should get respectable levels of burst DPS and hopefully have really decent clear. Now, I wouldn't under any circumstances recommend this to people. There's going to be way stronger builds out there from people who actually have the time to plan and play builds accordingly. I'm really busy at work, family life, and doing bits in the house at the moment, so I am, as I said, going to be playing this event really casually. Now, before you ask, the serial killer wallpaper is still around, but it's on the wall in front of me. I've just moved my desk around. So my plan for the event is to play a cold conversion Vile Smite Surfcaster, using a one-handed sword and shield. The idea behind the build is just to clear screens really quickly with Vile Smite, whilst being able to call on situational buffs to deal with bosses. Now, what I'm going to try and do is make this build as cheap and accessible as possible because I'm probably not going to have the time to farm lots and lots of currency in this event. So I want to be able to get this build up and running for a few divines. Now, before I go into my very, very rough POB, I want to state that I'm not going to be leveling the build with Smite. Because with Surfcaster or a Shadow, it's not a great position to start with a strength-based gem like Smite. Same with the sword, we're not near any sword nodes, so it's going to be pretty hard to get damage early on. So I'm going to level through the campaign with good old trusty Vile Lightning Strike and a Claw, and then I'll swap as soon as I can afford a decent sword, and I'm at least level 85. Now the build, as I said, should function at a really low budget, because I can't imagine there's many builds that are going to play a one-handed sword, so I should be able to get decent items pretty cheap if I decide not to craft them myself. Eventually I'd like to get things like Heat Shiver into the build because they synergize really well with the ascendancy, but it all depends how expensive they are. So before we jump into the POB, I'll just go over the ascendancy. The reason I want to play this is Smite is my favorite skill. I love Frostblades for the fact that you can freeze stuff, but I don't necessarily love Frostblades as a skill. This combines the two. It gives me the Smite skill and Vile Smite skill that I really like, with the fact that I can shock, turn on my damage into cold, so I can freeze, chill, shock, all in one go. It'll just be a ton of fun. As I said, it's not going to be anywhere near the best, most optimal build that people are playing. It's just what I want to do for fun, and that's how I'm going to treat this event. So you're always going to take, I would think, if this ascendancy Ghost of the Deep first, it's just amazing for leveling. I mean, it's just an amazing node all round, but for leveling, you're going to feel a massive improvement as soon as you get that first lab done. Then going to go and take Stormy Seas. This converts all the lightning damage into cold and the cold damage and shock. Because I'm going lightning strike to level, this will also work for that. Then going to take Glacial Waves so that we do more damage to chilled enemies and take less damage from chilled enemies. And then I'm going to have a play around with changing seasons, but I really don't want to do a lot to have to self-chill. So I think realistically my end 4th Ascendancy is probably going to be Brine Bound for the help on bosses. I plan to use Heat Shiver later on, so getting 1 second freeze when I freeze an enemy, that's really good. Also the fact that every other hit, on average when they hit me, an enemy is going to get frozen for 1 second. There's also a nice mastery that builds up the damage you do to enemies the longer you freeze them for in total. So I think this is probably one I'm going to take just for help on bossing. If I can find a way I want to self-chill without compromising too much on my gear, then I will look into it. But I think it's going to be Ghost of the Deep, Stormy Seas, Glacial Wave, and then Brine Bound. So we'll nip into the POB. Now this is very rough. Don't follow it or copy it. I will put a link in the video description, but this is half finished. Some of it might not work. Some of it I might change. This is just a template of what I want to do. So I mentioned I'm just going to level as a Lightning Strike Claw character. I may use this tree that I've put together. I might just copy someone else who's doing a Lightning Strike build because I haven't leveled this sort of build for a long time. This might be super suboptimal, but this was kind of my plan. The only thing I'm not sure on yet is when I get to maps whether I'll want to go precise technique, because it is very easy to get at least some crit chance on claws. They can roll quite high base crit on the claw itself. These claw nodes are really good here. And then you can do, Nightblade, take your Nightblade effect here, and it's probably already better than precise technique. All the cluster jewels are just fitted in for the smite build. These aren't anything I'm going to need when I'm running through as a lightning strike character. But the idea is just get a character that's quick, get via lightning strike up and running, get the double hit, get pierce, probably some returning projectiles, or point blank, one or the other. And then we'll just go until I've got enough currency. I will touch on how I plan to make some early currency at the end of the video. But really this is just to show what I want to do with this build. So once I've got, I would think, a few hundred chaos together, I can then switch to the build that I want to play. Now you could level with smite if you really wanted to, but it's going to feel really bad early on because there's just hardly any nodes around to help a sword one-handed character get damage. And damage is key when you're leveling. If you die the odd time, who cares? It's better to die a couple of times than spend 2 minutes on each boss. So I'm going to go with Claw and Lightning Strike because there's lots of ways to scale it around this area of the tree. So my final tree is going to look like this. I don't necessarily need all the clusters in when I switch, but this is what it's going to look like. I've got a Lethal Pride for what I want to do eventually, but again, early on, I'm definitely not going to have that, but they're very easy to self-farm. These two jewel sockets here are just so I could put in the ascendancy jewel, so these 2 points wouldn't be there. So you're looking at a 94, and this would be my finished tree. I don't need anything else after here. Once I got my attributes, I could also drop these to make it 92. But essentially what I'm looking to do is go as quick as I can when I'm clearing, and then have some situational buffs up to deal with map bosses and guardians, conquerors, things like that. In terms of ways to scale damage, we're going to look to get some clusters with sadist and any other cold mod on there. Same on here, because then if we can get some fire damage into the build, we already shock and chill anyway from our cold damage, so then we just need to be able to ignite, which will be a little bit of fire damage. And then that means that this node here, we get all three of the benefits. I'm also going to run Wrath, Determination, Grace, and Precision. So to do that, I need to take both of the reservation nodes here. Need to take the reservation mastery here, and then I also need to run a 50% reservation cluster jewel. That can be anything: Determination, Wrath, Grace. Grace is probably the better one because I think it gives you some ele resistances or evasion. It gives you something better than stun threshold. I am going precise technique just because it's too many nodes on the tree to try and get anywhere near half decent crit with a sword that's only got 5% base crit chance. And if I can get a setup like this, some of this is going to be slightly inflated because I've got the config set up for my end game setup. I've not messed around with matching configs with trees and item sets because I just haven't had the time to do it. But my end build would look something like this with a heat shiver. So in terms of the skills, I'm not sure what I want to run yet. I definitely want to get Fortify into the build. I'm not pathing all the way over here to get this Fortify node. So there's two options. One is a Fortified Gem. There's actually three. One is a Fortified Gem. It'll work, but it doesn't add a ton of damage, and it does nothing for the area hit for smite because that's not melee. The other option is you craft Chance to Fortify with melee hit on your body armor. Again, the massive problem with this is that area hit doesn't count because it's not melee, and a lot of the time with smite, you might only hit one enemy with your melee attack and everything else dies to your AoE. The experience I had when testing this is that Fortify is very, very rarely up, even on bosses, so that's a no as well. The last option, which I think should work, but probably won't on bosses, so I might need to switch this gem in, is we are running the Perseverance Belt, and what this offers you is the line melee hit, switch, stun, Fortify. Now, cold damage that crits cannot stun, but cold damage that doesn't crit can. And I have tested this and it seems to work. So as long as you're doing big enough hits, regardless of whether it's cold, lightning, fizz, or fire, you can stun. You do get a penalty of minus 25% for elemental damage to stun, but you get a buff of 25% for it being melee. My testing around in a smite build that I had Fortify up all of the time just from this melee stun. On bosses, you're probably not going to hit big enough to stun. So on things like Eater, Exarch, you're probably going to have to switch in your Fortify Gem if you want Fortification, which for this belt you do, because then you get Onslaught. It's just a combination of things that you want to be up all of the time. And so we're going to use a Heat Shiver in the end game version, as long as they're not multiple Divines, because it gives us lots of extra damage when enemies are frozen, because I'm taking the 1 second freeze mastery, it means every time I freeze a boss, I get 1 second of uptime of damage. It then adds to the mastery that adds 5% each time you freeze them for 1 second. And that's kind of it. Everything else is going to be well-crafted rares. I could look to get something like a taming in, but I think they might be really expensive this league, to the point where I might as well spend the divine crafting my own ring. I say these are all placeholder items. These are not items I necessarily expect to have. I've just been crafting stuff in POB and throwing it into the build. Cluster Jewel I've gone for. Again, it depends how often I get hit as to whether this is worthwhile, but spell hits count as well. And this essentially means every time I get hit, I gain an endurance charge every second. They'll then last 10 seconds. They run out. I get hit again. I regenerate charges. This is more for bossing, and I honestly don't know if it's worth it, but for now, we'll leave it in. And then we've just got a Lethal Pride with Intimidate. As I say, a lot of these items like the Lethal Pride will come later on. Clusters I don't think are going to be mega expensive, but if they are, we'll just run a different cluster jewel. The reason for running clusters is, firstly, I need these small cluster jewels here. Secondly, because we're precise technique, there's not really that many nodes that are decent to take. Pretty much any cluster jewel, even the mediocre large cluster jewels, are going to be better than taking nodes on the tree. And it allows you to slot gems in. So I'll just be looking for something like cold damage and attack speed, or life and attack speed. And this is pretty much the idea for the build. Now, clear maps should be simple. You don't need a lot of damage to clear T16 maps. And I'm hoping I've got enough layers of defenses to stay alive. We're going to be spell suppression capped. We're going to have some block chance because we're running a shield. Going to have fortify. Going to have endurance charges intermittently. And we're going to have the reduced damage taken from chilled enemies. We're also going to take some physical taken as elemental, as some implicits. So I'm hoping that this looks or acts tankier than it looks on paper. And if it isn't, I've got 6 portals. This isn't PoE 2. I'll have some fun either way. So we've got things like Frostbite for damage on bosses. It doesn't do a ton, but we don't have any mark really that's worthwhile. So Frostbite makes sense. Going to run Blood Rage just for the faster attacks and Frenzy Charge generation on kill. We'll have a Mastery here to give us Frenzy on bosses. Grace, Determination, Wrath, and then a Precision link to Arrogance as high as I need to push it for precise technique to work. Enduring Cry is what we're going to use if we need endurance charges on the fly. It's not a thing I love using all the time though, so this is more a thing to do at the beginning of a boss fight. I probably won't use it outside of that. And then we've got our Vile Smite set up. Now this DPS looks okay on paper, but you're not going to get this sort of damage all the time because this relies on things like a little bit of rage, which will come from the Lethal Pride. It will rely on being focused, which comes from my gear. It's going to rely on flask being up. Shock and chill you have all the time anyway. If it was a boss, let's say it was a 4-second freeze that you've done overall. This accuracy in here is just for precise technique to proc. I know I'm going to need to get accuracy on gear. So overall, there's lots and lots of, I wouldn't call it padding because I will get this damage in burst situations, but it's going to be not very often. The reason I've set it up like this is because when I get to a boss in a map, I can have all of this stuff up. I can have my tincture up. I can have my flask up. I can click focused. I can basically get all these buffs up. This isn't a permanent uptime DPS. If you are on a boss like Maven, for example, if we go, I mean, it might balance out because you would have things like this would be slightly increased, but your shock would probably be less. Your chill effect would probably be less. You're probably not going to have your tincture up all of the time. So if you take that off, you're then not going to have focus up all of the time. So again, you can take that off, take flasks off, and then you can see it kind of drops down, but it's still not the worst. It's still, for what is basically nothing up, it's still pretty decent damage for what I think is going to be fairly cheap gear. Again, one caveat, don't copy this. This is all muddled together very quickly. It will work, but will it be great? No, but I'm doing it because it's a ton of fun. If it turns out the build works really well on a budget, then I will bring a guide out. But for the moment, this is probably all you're getting, and I would recommend following someone else's build. But I'll post updates as and when. So how do I plan to make currency? This is a really unique event with the fact that there's no Atlas tree. All of your Atlas mechanics are tied to these relics. They drop from bosses. We don't know where else they drop from, and you can use a black market to buy them. However, the black market is 100,000 gold to unlock it, along with some Phrecia more, which makes me think it's a more, at least mid to end game thing. you're not going to be going into maps and buying relics and making currency from them. You can't rely on Atlas mechanics because you won't have the relics to force them in. So what I plan to do is look at things that just don't rely on the Atlas. That could be Heist, it could be Sanctum, it could be Delve. Anything that doesn't rely on the Atlas tree, I can use. The easiest one for me is going to be Heist. I'm not a massive Sanctum fan, and the builds I'm planning to play are about the worst you can use for Sanctum. Delve, again, I don't mind it, but I'm not a massive fan. I don't play it often. I don't know how to make currency from early delving. So I'm going to go into Heist for a couple of hours. And for anyone that isn't sure how to do it, there'll be tons of guides on YouTube. Just look for Heisting before Kitava, and it will tell you how to turn all your contracts into a lot of chaos. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this if you've got a build that's going to be really expensive, because you're going to be forever in Heist. But I probably need a couple of hundred chaos to transition to my Smite build, so I can go in Heist for a couple of hours, farm loads and loads of chaos, get out, then map. The reason I want to do that is because I don't have to rely on relics. I can just map. Doesn't matter what I drop, what relics I use. All I want to do is complete maps, level up, because the more levels I get, the stronger my character is going to get. And at that point, it's going to be a case for me of looking what relics are cheap and can I make the most of them. So let's say nobody wants to do Blight. So Blight relics are cheap. I'll buy them. I don't mind doing Blight. I quite enjoy it. Oils sell really well. Things that I think are going to be expensive are things like guaranteeing higher level essences, guaranteeing legions, expedition, harvest, delirium. All these things are going to be fairly expensive because they're going to be used by people. So along with trying to look for cheap relics that I can use to make some money, I'm also going to make sure that anytime I drop a relic, I check the price on the trade site, and if I drop one that's a jackpot, I'm selling it. I don't have any plans for what I want to do as a league mechanic on the Atlas yet. It's most likely going to be Blight because I think oils sell really well, but it's all dependent on how easy it is to get relics, and if I need to buy them, how much they're going to cost. So in a nutshell, if you want to make currency, look for things that don't rely on Atlas trees or Atlas nodes to be profitable. And then keep an eye on the relics that you're picking up. You could be sitting on a gold mine and not even know it. And lastly, I'm going to use the currency exchange where I can. People need all sorts of currency in the game. I want to turn all my currency that I'm not going to use into chaos so that I can then fund my build as quickly as possible. And that's kind of it for the video. The POB, as I say, very rough. Don't recommend you follow it, is in the video description. Thank you very much for watching. There will be update videos. I would think first one to come on Monday. And as I say, if the build works, I'll bring a fuller fleshed out guide with a proper POB. Take care. Hope everyone enjoys the event, and see you in the next one.